There comes a moment in every life when we realize something very simple, yet very deep. We are not as in control as we think we are. We plan our words, we prepare our responses, we try to manage our emotions, and yet in the middle of a conversation, something slips out that we later regret. In a moment of pressure, we say things we never intended to say. In a moment of frustration, we react in ways that do not reflect the person we desire to be. And slowly, honestly, we begin to see how much we need divine help, not just occasionally, but every single day. That is where surrender begins. Not as a sign of weakness, but as the beginning of true spiritual strength. When I say surrender, I do not mean giving up responsibility. I mean yielding control. Yielding the inner control of thoughts, words, reactions, and decisions to the Holy Spirit. Because without that surrender, we are constantly trying to manage life in our own ability, and it eventually becomes exhausting. But when we yield, something beautiful happens. There is a divine exchange, our confusion for His clarity, our impulsiveness for His wisdom, our weakness for His strength. And so before anything else happens in the day, before words are spoken, before actions are taken, there must be a simple but sincere moment of yielding. Holy Spirit, take control. Not as a ritual, not as a repeated phrase without meaning, but as a real invitation, a conscious release of self-rule. Because the truth is, the Holy Spirit does not force control upon us. He is invited. He responds to yielded hearts. When a person truly surrenders, even their speech begins to change. The tone softens. The anger that once rose quickly begins to lose its grip. The need to defend every opinion starts to fade. Why? Because the heart is no longer operating independently. It is being guided moment by moment. And I want you to understand this clearly. Surrender is not something that happens once and is finished. It is something that must be renewed continually, especially in the area of words. Words are powerful. Words can build and words can destroy. Words can heal and words can wound deeply. And so the control of words must be placed under divine guidance. There will be moments when you feel justified to speak harshly. Moments when your emotions rise so strongly that everything in you wants to respond immediately. But in those very moments, surrender becomes real. That is where you pause inwardly and say again, Holy Spirit, govern my response. And sometimes that pause is only a second long, but it is in that second that destiny is shaped. Because many regrets are born from reactions that were never surrendered. A surrendered life is not a perfect life. It is a dependent life. It is a life that acknowledges I need help beyond myself. And that dependence brings peace. You begin to notice that situations that once provoked anger no longer control you the same way. Not because the situations have changed, but because the inner governance has changed. The Spirit begins to influence what comes out of you, and what once felt natural in the flesh begins to feel foreign. And let me say this gently but clearly, no one drifts into surrender. It is a deliberate choice. Each day, each hour, sometimes there is a turning of the heart, a returning of control, a laying down of self-will. And in that laying down there is freedom. Not restriction, but freedom. Freedom from regretful words. Freedom from impulsive decisions. Freedom from internal chaos. So today, even as you hear these words, let something shift within you. Not in theory, but in practice. Let there be a willingness to no longer carry the burden of self-governance alone. Invite the one who guides gently, yet powerfully, to take his rightful place within your thoughts, within your speech, and within your reactions. And when you do, you will discover something you did not expect. Not just better control, but a transformed way of living from within. A quiet strength, a steady peace, a guided life. Holy Spirit, take control of my life completely. There is something deeply revealing about words. They often expose what the heart is carrying long before we have time to think about it. A sudden reply, a sharp tone, an unfiltered reaction. These are not just words, they are reflections of what is happening within. And so, if the heart is not guided, the mouth becomes a place where disorder can easily overflow. That is why it is so important to understand that speech is not merely a human function, it is a spiritual responsibility. Before a word is spoken, there is a moment, sometimes so brief that we barely notice it, where choice is made. It is in that unseen moment that the direction of our words is formed. Will this be spoken in anger or in peace? Will this build or will it break? Will this reflect fleshly impulse or will it reflect divine guidance? And often, the difference between wisdom and regret is found in whether we pause inwardly long enough to allow the Holy Spirit to intervene. Inviting divine guidance before speaking is not about becoming silent or overly cautious in a fearful way. It is about becoming sensitive. It is about developing an awareness that we are not speaking into empty space, we are speaking into lives, hearts, and situations that can be deeply affected by what we release from our mouths. A careless sentence can wound someone far more than we realize. A harsh response can linger in a person's memory long after the moment has passed. But a word guided by the Spirit can bring healing, calmness, and direction that human effort alone cannot produce. And so, there is a simple yet powerful practice. Before speaking, even in the middle of conversation, there is an inward turning. It may not be visible to others, but it is very real within. A quiet acknowledgement, Holy Spirit, guide my words. Not loudly spoken every time, not performed outwardly, but deeply felt inwardly. That moment of yielding changes the atmosphere of communication. It slows down the rush of reaction. It brings clarity where confusion was rising. It allows truth to be expressed without the weight of emotion distorting it. There will always be situations that try to pull words out of you quickly. A disagreement, a misunderstanding, a moment of offense. These are the places where speech is most vulnerable. In those moments, it is easy to speak before thinking, to defend before discerning, to react before reflecting. But when the Holy Spirit is invited into the process of speech, something different begins to take place. There is an inner restraint that is not suppression, but wisdom. There is a gentle prompting that says, wait, or speak softly, or sometimes even, do not respond right now. And learning to recognize that inner guidance is one of the most powerful transformations a person can experience. Because it means that speech is no longer driven only by emotion or circumstance, but by divine direction. Words begin to carry weight, not because they are louder or stronger, but because they are purer and more intentional. They are no longer just reactions. They become responses shaped by peace. It is important to understand that guided speech does not mean perfect speech in the sense of never making mistakes. It means a growing sensitivity, a growing dependence, a growing awareness that every conversation is an opportunity to reflect something higher than ourselves. And over time, as this awareness deepens, even the tone of life begins to shift. Relationships begin to heal. Misunderstandings become easier to resolve. Conflicts lose some of their intensity because words are no longer fueling them in the same destructive way. There is also a quiet strength that comes with spirit-guided speech. It is not loud or forceful, but it carries authority. People begin to sense that your words are not merely emotional reactions, but thoughtful expressions rooted in peace. And even when correction is needed, it is delivered in a way that does not destroy dignity but helps restore direction. So in every conversation, whether small or significant, there is this sacred opportunity to pause within and invite divine guidance. Not after the words are spoken, not after the damage is done, but before the tongue releases what the heart is carrying. That simple surrender transforms ordinary communication into something far more meaningful. And in that place of yielded speech, there is wisdom beyond human understanding, peace beyond human control, and clarity that changes everything. Holy Spirit, guide my words today, and let every word I speak reflect your presence. There is a truth that cannot be ignored. What comes out of a person's life is always connected to what is happening within the heart. Actions do not appear out of nowhere. They are formed quietly, often invisibly, in the inner world of thoughts, desires, and attitudes. And so, when we speak about transformation in behavior, we are not speaking about surface-level adjustment. We are speaking about something far deeper, something that begins at the root. Many people try to change their actions without addressing their hearts, and that is where the struggle begins. They try harder, they discipline themselves, they set rules, they make resolutions. Yet over time, the same patterns tend to return. Why? Because the heart has not yet been fully yielded. Real transformation does not come from external pressure. It comes from internal renewal. And this is where the Holy Spirit works in a profound and gentle way. When the Holy Spirit begins to move within a person, he does not simply correct behavior from the outside. He begins to reshape the inner life. He touches thoughts before they become actions. He deals with attitudes before they become habits. He brings conviction not to condemn, but to cleanse. And in that quiet inner working, something begins to shift that human effort alone could never accomplish. There is a sacred process involved in this transformation. It is not instant, and it is not always dramatic in appearance, but it is deeply real. A person begins to notice that certain reactions no longer feel natural. Things that once seemed acceptable begin to feel heavy on the conscience. Words that once came easily now feel restrained. Not because of external pressure, but because something within has changed. The heart is being refined, and this is where yielding becomes so important. To yield the heart means to allow the Holy Spirit access not just to selected areas, but to everything hidden within. Thoughts that are private, motives that are unspoken, attitudes that are never expressed outwardly but still influence behavior. When these areas are surrendered, transformation becomes inevitable. Because a heart that is open to divine influence cannot remain the same. There is also a gentle but persistent work that takes place in this process. The Holy Spirit does not rush, but he is thorough. He does not force change, but he consistently brings light into places that were once overlooked, and as that light enters, understanding grows. A person begins to see themselves differently, not with shame, but with clarity. And that clarity becomes the beginning of real change. Out of that inner transformation, actions begin to follow naturally. It is no longer about forcing yourself to behave differently. It becomes about responding differently because you are being shaped differently. Patience begins to rise where irritation once dominated. Compassion begins to appear where judgment once took hold. Self-control begins to strengthen where impulse once ruled. And all of this flows from a heart that is under divine influence. There is something very beautiful about this kind of transformation. It is not artificial. It is not performed. It is lived. And others begin to notice it, sometimes without you even realizing it. The way you respond changes. The way you carry yourself changes. The way you handle pressure changes. Not because you are trying to appear different, but because you are becoming different from within. And yet this process requires continued surrender. It is not a one-time experience. The heart must remain open, soft, and responsive. The moment a person begins to resist inner conviction, transformation slows. But when there is a continual willingness to say, Holy Spirit, shape me again today, then the work continues. It deepens, it strengthens, it becomes more stable and more consistent. There will be moments when old patterns try to return, when familiar reactions attempt to rise again, but even then something within begins to respond differently. There is an awareness that says, this is not who I am becoming. And that awareness is not self-generated, it is the result of a heart being guided and renewed. So the real question is not simply what should I do differently? The deeper question is what needs to be transformed within me so that my actions naturally reflect something higher. And when that question is sincerely placed before the Holy Spirit, change begins at the root level. Because when the heart is transformed, the life cannot remain the same. Holy Spirit, transform my heart completely so that every action of my life reflects your presence. There is a kind of awareness that changes everything about how a person lives. It is not merely awareness of surroundings, nor awareness of time, nor even awareness of responsibility. It is something deeper. Something more sacred, the awareness that the presence of God is not distant, not occasional, not reserved for special moments, but constantly near. When this truth settles into the heart, it begins to reshape behavior, speech, and even thought patterns in a quiet but powerful way. Many struggles in life come not from a lack of knowledge, but from a lack of awareness. A person may know what is right and still drift into what is wrong simply because in that moment they forget they are not alone. They forget that every environment is observed not only by people, but by the presence of the Holy Spirit. And when that awareness fades, reactions become careless, words become unguarded, and actions lose their sensitivity. But when a person begins to live with a conscious awareness of divine presence, something changes within them. It is as if life becomes more intentional. The heart begins to slow down before reacting. The mind begins to weigh words more carefully. The spirit becomes more sensitive to inner prompting. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. A gentle awareness begins to settle in that says, I am not walking through this moment alone. And this awareness does not have to be loud or dramatic. In fact, it is often quiet. It is the kind of awareness that sits in the background of every decision, every conversation, every response. It is not something that interrupts life, it is something that accompanies life. And when it becomes consistent, it begins to guide behavior in subtle but meaningful ways. There will be moments when emotions rise, when situations feel overwhelming, when pressure builds quickly. In those moments, it is easy to become reactive, to speak without thinking, to act without reflection. But when awareness of the Holy Spirit is active within the heart, even those moments begin to shift. There is a pause, not forced but natural. A sense that says, I am not alone in this moment. And that awareness alone can change the direction of a reaction. This kind of awareness also brings a quiet accountability, not in a heavy or condemning sense, but in a refining sense. It helps a person realize that even in private moments, even in unseen decisions, there is no separation from divine presence. And instead of producing fear, it produces care. Care in speech, care in attitude, care in the way one treats others when no one is watching. And over time, this awareness becomes a shield against many unnecessary mistakes. Not because life becomes easier, but because the inner life becomes more attentive. A person begins to recognize early signs of impatience before it turns into harshness. They begin to sense rising emotions before they become damaging words. They begin to feel internal tension before it becomes external conflict. This sensitivity is not human instinct alone. It is the result of a heart that has learned to remain aware of divine nearness. There is also a deep peace that comes with this awareness. Because when you are conscious of the Holy Spirit's presence, you are no longer carrying life alone. Even in uncertainty, there is companionship. Even in difficulty, there is guidance. Even in silence, there is reassurance. And that quiet assurance stabilizes the soul in a way that external circumstances cannot shake. But this awareness must be cultivated. It does not remain strong without attention. Life has a way of distracting the mind, pulling focus toward urgency, noise, and pressure. And slowly, without realizing it, a person can begin to live as though they are alone again. That is why there must be a continual return inward, a continual remembering, a continual recentering of the heart toward divine presence. It can be as simple as a moment of acknowledgement during the day, a pause in the middle of activity, a quiet turning of the heart that says, "You are here with me." And in that simple recognition, awareness is renewed, sensitivity is restored, the inner life becomes aligned again. And when this awareness becomes steady, life itself begins to change. Not because circumstances are always different, but because the response to circumstances is now guided by something higher. Words are chosen more carefully, actions are weighed more thoughtfully, reactions are softened by inner restraint. So the goal is not simply to believe in the presence of the Holy Spirit in theory, but to live in conscious awareness of that presence in practice. Because when awareness becomes living reality, transformation naturally follows. Holy Spirit, make me constantly aware of your presence so that every moment of my life is guided by you. There is a struggle that every human being understands, whether spoken or unspoken. It is the struggle between what we feel in a moment and what we know is right, between impulse and restraint, between reaction and wisdom, between the sudden rise of emotion and the quiet strength of self-control. And in that inner conflict, many lives are shaped more by reaction than by reflection. Self-control is often misunderstood as something purely human, something achieved by discipline alone. But true self-control goes deeper than willpower. Willpower can last for a moment, but it often weakens under pressure. Real stability comes from something greater than internal effort. It comes from dependence on the Holy Spirit, who strengthens the inner life in ways human strength cannot sustain. There are moments when emotions rise so quickly that it feels almost impossible to pause. Words are ready to come out before thought can form. Decisions feel urgent even when they are not wise. And in those moments, the natural tendency is to respond immediately. But this is exactly where spiritual dependence becomes powerful, because the Holy Spirit does not just teach truth. He strengthens the ability to live out that truth in real time. When a person begins to rely on the Holy Spirit for self-control, something begins to shift within their responses. It is not that emotions disappear, but that emotions no longer dominate. There is a new strength rising within that says, I do not have to be controlled by what I feel in this moment. And that strength is not forced, it is supplied. It is received through dependence, not achieved through pressure. There is a quiet but powerful change that takes place when a person learns to pause internally before reacting. That pause may be very brief, but it becomes the space where wisdom enters. In that moment, instead of being driven by impulse, the heart begins to turn upward, even if only for a second. And in that turning, there is a subtle request, strengthen me right now. And the Holy Spirit responds not with noise, but with inner stability. Self-control, guided by the Spirit, does not make a person emotionally numb. It does not remove personality or passion. Instead, it brings order to emotion. It aligns reaction with wisdom. It allows strength to be expressed without destruction. It allows truth to be spoken without harm. And it allows correction when needed to be delivered without losing compassion. There will still be challenging moments. There will still be situations that provoke, disappoint, or frustrate. But the difference is no longer in the absence of pressure. The difference is in the presence of help within that pressure. And that inner help begins to reshape how situations are handled. What once led to immediate reaction now becomes an opportunity for guided response. And as this dependence grows, a person begins to recognize patterns. They begin to see how certain environments trigger certain responses. They begin to notice how certain words from others can quickly stir emotions. But instead of being trapped by those patterns, there is now awareness, and with awareness comes the ability to yield. In that yielding, strength is supplied again and again. There is also a deep humility that develops through this process, because it becomes clear that self-control is not simply a personal achievement, it is a continuous cooperation with divine strength. It is the recognition that without help, reactions would easily take over, but with help, reactions can be governed. And that recognition keeps the heart dependent rather than self-reliant. And here is something very important. Every time self-control is surrendered to the Holy Spirit, the inner capacity to handle future situations grows stronger. It is not just a temporary restraint, it becomes a developing strength within. The more a person yields, the more stable their responses become. The more they depend, the more consistent their reactions become. And slowly, what once felt like a struggle begins to feel like a guided flow. So the goal is not perfection in emotional control by human effort. The goal is a life continually connected to divine strength, where every reaction is shaped by inner guidance rather than external pressure. A life where even in the most intense moments, there is still a quiet dependence saying, "Help me respond rightly." And in that dependence, something beautiful begins to form, a steady, spirit-led strength that holds the heart in peace even when everything around it is unsettled. Holy Spirit, strengthen my self-control so that every reaction of my life reflects your wisdom and peace. There is something deeply important about beginnings, but there is something even more powerful about continuity. Many people begin with sincerity. They begin with prayer, with intention, with a desire to live differently. But the true challenge is not in starting well. It is in continuing faithfully when life becomes ordinary again, when emotions settle, when distractions return, and when daily pressures begin to press in. Consistency in spiritual life is often where transformation is either strengthened or weakened. It is not enough to experience moments of inspiration. It is not enough to feel moved in a single prayer. The real change is seen in how a life is lived hour after hour, decision after decision, response after response. And this is where obedience becomes the true measure of inner transformation. Obedience is not always dramatic. It is often quiet. It is found in small choices that no one else may notice. It is found in choosing patience when impatience would be easier. It is found in choosing truth when exaggeration would be more convenient. It is found in choosing restraint when reaction would feel more satisfying in the moment. And yet these small moments are where spiritual depth is formed. There is a natural tendency to separate prayer from daily living, as though prayer belongs to one part of life and actions belong to another. But true spiritual growth does not allow that separation. What is prayed for in the quiet place must be lived out in the open place. What is surrendered in prayer must be demonstrated in action. And what is received in moments of reflection must be expressed in moments of interaction. Walking in daily obedience means allowing the Holy Spirit not only to speak in moments of prayer but to lead in moments of routine. It means recognizing that guidance is not limited to major decisions, but extends into conversations, responses, attitudes, and even silent thoughts. There is no area too small for divine direction, and no moment too ordinary for spiritual sensitivity. And yet, consistency requires humility. Because there will be times when a person feels they have grown stronger, only to discover that certain patterns still try to return. There will be moments when old habits attempt to resurface, when familiar reactions try to reclaim influence. And in those moments, consistency is not about discouragement. It is about returning again, returning to surrender, returning to awareness, returning to dependence. This is why obedience must be continuous, not occasional, not selective, not dependent on mood or circumstance, but steady. Because transformation is not built in isolated moments, it is built in repeated yielding. Each time a person chooses obedience over impulse, strength is reinforced within them. Each time they choose guidance over reaction, sensitivity deepens. Each time they choose peace over conflict, the inner life becomes more stable. There is also something beautiful that happens when obedience becomes consistent. It no longer feels like pressure, but like alignment. What once felt like effort begins to feel like flow. What once felt like struggle begins to feel like cooperation, because the heart is no longer constantly resisting guidance, it is learning to move with it, and in that movement there is peace. And over time others begin to notice the fruit of this consistency, not through words alone but through behavior. There is a steadiness that was not there before. There is a calmness in response that stands out. There is a wisdom in conversation that feels deeper than natural reaction. And yet the source remains the same, a life that continues to yield. But consistency must be guarded. because distractions will always try to interrupt it. Pressure will always try to weaken it. Familiar environments will sometimes try to pull a person back into old patterns. That is why daily dependence is so important. Not a one-time decision, but a repeated turning of the heart. A continual awareness that says, I need guidance again today. And in that continual obedience, transformation is not only maintained but deepened. The inner life becomes more stable. The reactions become more refined. The decisions become more aligned with peace and wisdom. And what begins as intentional effort slowly becomes a lifestyle shaped by divine influence. So the invitation is not simply to experience guidance in moments, but to walk in it consistently. Not only when it feels easy, but when it requires surrender. Not only when emotions are calm, but when life feels uncertain. Because true transformation is revealed in daily obedience. Holy Spirit, lead my life every day so that my walk with you is consistent, faithful, and fully surrendered in every moment.